transportation system, especially rail yards and canals. 278. The armaments industry began to break down by September 1944. By November, fuel coal was no longer reaching its destinations and the production of new armaments was no longer possible. 279. Overy argues that the bombing strained the German war economy and forced it to divert up to 1/4 of its manpower and industry into anti-aircraft sources, which very likely shortened the war. 280. Racial policy and eugenics. Racism and antisemitism. Racism and antisemitism were basic tenets of the Nazi Party and the Nazi regime. Nazi Germany's racial policy was based on their belief in the existence of a superior master race. The Nazis postulated the existence of a racial conflict between the Aryan master race and inferior races, particularly Jews, who were viewed as a mixed race that had infiltrated society and were responsible for the exploitation and repression of the Aryan race. 281. Persecution of Jews. Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses, April 1933. The posters say Germans defend ourselves. Don't buy from Jews. Discrimination against Jews began immediately after the seizure of power. Following a month-long series of attacks by members of the SA on Jewish businesses and synagogues, on 1 April 1933 Hitler declared a national boycott of Jewish businesses. 282. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service passed on the 7th of April forced all non-Aryan civil servants to retire from the legal profession and civil service. 283. Similar legislation soon deprived other Jewish professionals of their right to practice, and on 11 April a decree was promulgated that stated anyone who had even un-Jewish parent or grandparent was considered non-Aryan. 284. As part of the drive to remove Jewish influence from cultural life, members of the National Socialist German Students' League removed from libraries any books considered UN German, and a nationwide book burning was held on 10 May. 285. The regime used violence and economic pressure to encourage Jews to leave the country voluntarily. 286. Jewish businesses were denied access to markets, forbidden to advertise, and deprived of access to government contracts. Citizens were harassed and subjected to violent attacks. 287. Many towns posted signs forbidding entry to Jews. 288. On the 7th of November 1938 a young Jewish man, Herschel Greenspan, shot and killed Ernst von Rath, Algatian secretary at the German embassy in Paris, to protest his family's treatment in Germany. This incident provided the pretext for a pogrom the Nazis incited against the Jews 2 days later. Members of the SA damaged or destroyed synagogues and Jewish property throughout Germany. At least 91 German Jews were murdered during this pogrom, later called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. 289. 290. Further restrictions were imposed on Jews in the coming months. They were forbidden to own businesses or work in retail shops, drive cars, go to the cinema, visit the library, or own weapons, and Jewish pupils were removed from schools. The Jewish community was fined 1 billion marks to pay for the damage caused by Kristallnacht and told that any insurance settlements would be confiscated. 291. By 1939, around 250,000 of Germany's 437,000 Jews had emigrated to the United States, Argentina, Great Britain, Palestine, and other countries. 292. 293. Many chose to stay in continental Europe. Emigrants to Palestine were allowed to transfer property there under the terms of the Havurah Agreement. but those moving to the countries had to leave virtually all their property behind, and it was seized by the government. 293. Persecution of Romani. Like the Jews, the Romani were subjected to persecution from the early days of the regime. The Romani were forbidden to marry people of German extraction. They were shipped to concentration camps starting in 1935 and many were murdered. 174, 175. Following the invasion of Poland, 2,500 Roma and Sinti people were deported from Germany to the general government, where they were imprisoned in labor camps. The survivors were likely exterminated at Belzec, Sobibor, or Treblinka. A further 5,000 Sinti and Austrian Lalari people were deported to the Lodz ghetto in late 1941, where half were estimated to have died. The Romani survivors of the ghetto were subsequently moved to the Chelmo extermination camp in early 1942. 294. The Nazis intended on deporting all Romani people from Germany, and confined them to Ziegenlager, gypsy camps, for this purpose. Himmler ordered their deportation from Germany in December 1942, with few exceptions. A total of 23,000 Romani were deported to Auschwitz concentration camp, of whom 19,000 died. Outside of Germany, the Romani people were regularly used for forced labor, though many were murdered outright. In the Baltic states and the Soviet Union, 30,000 Romani were murdered by the SS, the German army, and Einsatzgruppen. In occupied Serbia, 1,000 to 12,000 Romani were murdered, while nearly all 25,000 Romani living in the independent state of Croatia were murdered. The estimates at end of the war put the total number of Romani victims at around 220,000, which equaled approximately 25% of the Romani population in Europe. 294. Other persecuted groups. Poster from the Nazi Party's Office of Racial Policy, 60000 RM is what this person with hereditary illness costs the community in his lifetime. Fellow citizen, that is your money too. Action T4 was a program of systematic murder of the physically and mentally handicapped and patients in psychiatric hospitals that took place mainly from 1939 to 1941, and continued until the end of war. Initially the victims were shot by the Einsatzgruppen and others. Gas chambers and gas vans using carbon monoxide were used by early 1940. 295, 296, under the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, enacted on the 14th of July 1933, over 400,000 individuals underwent compulsory sterilization. 297, over half were those considered mentally deficient, which included not only people who scored poorly on intelligence tests, but those who deviated from expected standards of behavior regarding thrift, sexual behavior, and cleanliness. Most of the victims came from disadvantaged groups such as prostitutes, the poor, the homeless, and criminals. 298. Other groups persecuted and murdered include Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, social misfits, and members of the political and religious opposition. 175, 299, General Plan Ost. Germany's war in the East was based on Hitler's long-standing view that Jews were the great enemy of the German people and that Lebensraum was needed for Germany's expansion. Hitler focused his attention on Eastern Europe, aiming to conquer Poland and the Soviet Union. 171, 172, Hitler's belief in the racial inferiority of Russians, as well as Slavs in general, had convinced him that a German conquest of Russia was inevitable. 300, after the occupation of Poland in 1939, All Jews living in the general government were confined to ghettos, and those who were physically fit were required to perform compulsory labor. 301. In 1941 Hitler decided to destroy the Polish nation completely. Within 15 to 20 years the general government was to be cleared of ethnic Poles and resettled by German colonists. 302. About 3.8 to 4 million Poles would remain our slaves. 303. Part of a slave labor force of 14 million the Nazis intended to create using citizens of conquered nations. 172. 304. To determine who should be killed, Himmler created the Volkslist, a system of classification of people deemed to be of German blood. 305. He ordered that those of Germanic descent who refused to be classified as ethnic Germans should be deported to concentration camps, have their children taken away, or be assigned to forced labor. 306. 307. The plan also included the kidnapping of children deemed to have Aryan Nordic traits, who were presumed to be of German descent. 308. The goal was to implement General Plan Ost after the conquest of the Soviet Union. But when the invasion failed, Hitler had to consider other options. 309. 310. One suggestion was a mass forced deportation of Jews to Poland, Palestine, or Madagascar. 301. In addition, the Nazis planned to reduce the population of the conquered territories by 30 million people through starvation in an action called the Hunger Plan. Food supplies would be diverted to the German army and German civilians. Cities would be razed and the land allowed to return to forest or resettled by German colonists. 311. Together, the Hunger Plan and General Plan Ost would have led to the starvation of 80 million people in the Soviet Union. 312. These partially fulfilled plans resulted in the democratic deaths of an estimated 19.3 million civilians and prisoners of war, POWs, throughout the USSR and elsewhere in Europe. 313. During the course of the war, the Soviet Union lost a total of 27 million people, less than 9 million of these were combat deaths. 314. 1 in 4 of the Soviet population were killed or wounded. 315. The Holocaust and final solution. A wagon piled high with corpses outside the crematorium in the Buchenwald concentration camp liberated by the U.S. Army, 1945. Around the time of the failed offensive against Moscow in December 1941, Hitler resolved that the Jews of Europe were to be terminated immediately. 316. While the murder of Jewish civilians had been ongoing in the occupied territories of Poland and the Soviet Union, plans for the total eradication of the Jewish population of Europe, 11 million people, were formalized at Wannsee Conference on the 20th of January, 1942. Some would be worked to death and the rest would be murdered in the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question. 317. Initially the victims were murdered by Einsatzgruppen firing squads, then by stationary gas chambers or by gas vans, but these methods proved impractical for an operation of this scale. 318. 319. By 1942 extermination camps equipped with gas chambers were established at Auschwitz, Chelmno, Sobibor, Treblinka, and elsewhere. 320. The total number of Jews murdered is estimated at 5.5 to 6 million, 234, including over a million children. 321. The Allies received information about the murders from the Polish government in exile and Polish leadership in Warsaw, based mostly on intelligence from the Polish underground. 322. 323. German citizens had access to information about what was happening. as soldiers returning from the occupied territories reported on what they had seen and done. 324. Historian Richard J. Evans states that most German citizens disapproved of the genocide. 325. Oppression of ethnic Poles. Poles were viewed by Nazis as subhuman non-Aryans, and during the German occupation of Poland 2.7 million ethnic Poles died. 326. Polish civilians were subject to forced labor in German industry internment, wholesale expulsions to make way for German colonists, and mass execution.